Welcome to Crying Out Cloud, the podcast that will make you laugh, cry, and reconsider all of your cloud security fears. I'm Eden. I'm here with my amazing co-host, Amitai.
Hello.
Today we brought on a super cool friend of the pod, Rami, to talk about one of our hot news topics. Rami, say hi.
Hi, longtime listener, first time caller. Glad to be here.
Yay. Rami is a principal security researcher at Wiz. He previously worked on infrastructure and cloud security at Figma and as a security consultant and helped scale security for a health tech unicorn. And he infrequently writes about security on tldrsec.com. And let's jump into it. Amitai, what are the topics we are going to cover today?
So today we are going to be talking about GitHub Action supply chain attack, which Robbie will be elaborating on and telling us the story. We'll be talking about a few updates about IngressNightmare, which we spoke about on the last episode. We'll talk a bit about the alleged Oracle breaches, and we'll talk about a vulnerability in Next.js.
Let's start with the GitHub quadruple supply chain attack. Rami, tell us what happened.
Yeah, this is super interesting. I think the quadruple is the load bearing point here. So, over the past few weeks, news has been rolling out, a lot of it coming from us here at Wiz, about a supply chain attack that was initially reported by Step Security back around March 14th or 15th, I want to say. And the initial report was that an action called TJ Actions changed files. This is a small piece of reusable code, part of GitHub Actions, had all of its GitHub tags, a way to reference that action, compromised and pointed at malicious code that would search for any secrets in the action and dump those to public GitHub workflow logs. So this news broke and caused a bit of a scramble in the industry initially. There was this one action. It had turned malicious. We weren't quite sure how. We dug in and found out that the scope was thankfully reduced to only public repositories with secrets in use, which is on the order of a couple dozen repositories had sensitive secrets leaked publicly. And then, of course, this action is used by 20,000 repositories total. And so there are a number of companies that have to chase this down privately. But it doesn't stop there. Like, the initial report left a lot of open questions on, like, how did this happen and why did this happen? And on the how, we ended up here at Wiz finding a initial step in this attack chain, which was an action called ReviewDog Action Setup, was used by the TJ Actions repository itself. And we found that while TJ Actions was compromised for 22 hours and all the tags were changed, targeted the whole industry, every user, ReviewDog's action was actually changed first for a period of 2 hours, seemingly very narrowly targeting TJ Action. So we're down to a double supply chain here. We have ReviewDog getting targeted, hitting TJ Actions. Of course, this is a supply chain. We crawl back up that line and we ask, like, okay, but how did ReviewDog get hit here? And eventually working with the maintainer there. And again, this is an open source ecosystem with volunteer maintainers who had their nights and weekends ruined by this incident and have done a great job jumping on it. The maintainer there was able to figure out, with support from GitHub support, that one of their contributors had a GitHub personal access token compromise that allowed them to update the tags on ReviewDog. How did that happen? The contributor was active in another open source project that had a GitHub Actions vulnerability called a pwn request. This is a GitHub Actions vulnerability where if you use the type of action trigger called pull request target, anyone who can open a PR, code on a fork, can run arbitrary code often in the context of your action, which makes it very easy to steal secrets. So there was this like vulnerable GitHub action in an open source repository. The attacker exploited it, got a personal access token, pivoted into ReviewDog, pivoted into TJ Actions. And so that's the third level here. The fourth level then was published even more recently This was something that we found and also Unit 42 found concurrently. And the result there was we identified that the attacker throughout this process seems to have been targeting Coinbase specifically. There are payloads that explicitly target only Coinbase as part of this attack chain. We think the attacker, it appears, was targeting Coinbase, was unsuccessful, and then decided to burn their access and target everyone by this broad TJ Actions attack. I'll put a pin there. I think that gives us all 4 little slices, and we can cover a little bit more and then move on to other things.
So we know the end of the chain, right? Like we know how the 4th one was compromised. So it doesn't go like another 10 steps.
So it doesn't go another 10 steps, but there are 2 interesting elements to that. One, to me, is that this is very repeatable. These GitHub Actions flaws are well known and explored in research, and we haven't seen them used by attackers much. And this might be a starting gun on attackers exploiting GitHub Actions. Notably, Praetorian published a blog post with a very similar vulnerability in CodeQL's action itself. This blog just came out recently. And if obviously an attacker had been able to exploit it against CodeQL, the blast radius is even larger than of TJ Actions changed files because so many folks use CodeQL. The other thing to me beyond is this attack pattern repeatable is the fact that the supply chain's really complicated. And so beyond attackers actively repeating this, it doesn't necessarily feel like we have actually remediated anything. We fixed one instance of a flaw. We've worked with 2 specific maintainers and supported them here. We've raised some awareness. We've published some guidance that we can go into. But fundamentally, there's a lot of work to be done in this supply chain. And I think part of what we're working on is the industry is wondering, how can I prevent these? Like, how much do I have to worry about recurrence? And that's really something that is an open question.
Do you think there are things that like GitHub, GitLab could be doing to make this harder to exploit? Like, is there an equivalent here of like a S3 block public access to sort of stop this by default, or is it just too complicated?
I think there is, and it's been something GitHub's been exploring for a long time. So there's an open GitHub roadmap item for immutable actions that would have made this a lot less likely to be as exploitable of an issue and as complicated an ecosystem. GitHub Actions can be referred to in a few ways. So if you're going to use a GitHub action, you can use it with the code on the master branch of that action. Please don't do this. You can use it with semantic tagging, so major version, minor version, full version tagging. Don't do that either. And you can do it by commit hash. Commit hashes are already immutable. And so if you reference a GitHub action by commit hash, you wouldn't have been vulnerable in the TJ Actions case to TJ Actions going malicious. However, transitively, just because you reference an action by commit hash, if they use an action that's not pinned well, or a 3rd or 4th tier in the chain, immutable actions would make it so that instead of mutable tags that can later be pointed to different code, actions tagging would be reliant on much more of the commit hash form. They would make an immutable reference the standard there. And that's one element of them continuing to improve how these are referenced and packaged, very similar to things like the Salsa framework for supply chain security, right? Looking at immutable, reproducible packaging. So I think that that's something that, if I recall correctly, that roadmap item has been outstanding for a few years. And GitHub had recently reset the date, I believe, to later in this year prior to this incident. And it'll be interesting to see whether that or some other product enhancement comes down the line even faster in response to this incident and the concerns here.
Like upvote, upvote, upvote.
Yes, you can go search it. I'm pretty sure I have a little like thumbs up on it.
You should do like a GitHub action supply chain attack that causes all GitHub users to upvote that item. And then when
Honestly, this is one of the classic like gray hat fix vulnerabilities that used to happen with like appliance CVEs, where someone would scan the internet and exploit it to patch. Like someone should exploit GitHub Actions and just use it to add hash pinning everywhere.
yeah. And I just wanted to make sure I understand. Like, this wouldn't necessarily have stopped the action itself from being compromised, but it would have stopped like the chain, right? Like it would have blocked the compromise of other actions.
So it's a quadruple attack. So hash pinning would not have stopped the initial pwn request that got the review dog contributor. That is sort of divorced from the action supply chain itself. However, review dog had a tag updated that TJ Actions was using. And so if TJ Actions had been hash pinning review dog, there wouldn't have been the possibility to pivot in that way. And if users were pinning TJ Actions, they wouldn't have been impacted, and they weren't impacted by TJ Actions because in both those cases, the attack was based on a tag update. It's worth noting that this attack was caught relatively quickly. Again, when they went broad, it was really noisy. You can see that no one noticed the 2-hour review dog compromise initially. We only found it retroactively once there was the broader noisy attack. And so there are attacks that could rely on people organically updating even pinned hashes. Hash pinning only works if you review code when it's been updated. And generally, if you're not automated bumping those hashes, we actually saw in the TJ Actions case, there are folks who were using hash pinning with automated tooling to programmatically bump those hashes. And a handful of repos, very rare, but in the impacted window, had their hash updated to pin to the bad version.
So that still wouldn't have necessarily solved. Like, it's not a perfect solution.
There are no perfect solutions. No, welcome to security. Yeah.
That's our quote for this episode. There are no perfect solutions. Okay. So if you want to read more about this, you can go to the guidance we published, and we will link it in the episode notes. And the rest of the stories won't be as exciting without Rami, but thank you for joining us and giving us such good context and information on this story.
Thanks for having me on. I'm sure I'll worm my way back in sometime in the future.
For our second story, we have the IngressNightmare continued, because we already brought this up in our last episode, but it is a Kubernetes vulnerability that is still keeping us up at night, hence the name. TLDR is that Nir and the research team found a vulnerability in a component used in Kubernetes clusters that allows for remote code execution as soon as you have access to the cluster. Dun, dun, dun. Amitai, can you give us a little bit of an update on the current exploitation status?
Yeah, so I think the main thing is that we're starting to see some exploitation in the wild of this. Like looking at Gray Noise, you can see that they had a spike, I think a day after the vulnerability was publicly reported, where like they added a tag, and you can see that there are some IPs that they're flagging as malicious, scanning for this vulnerability. And there are already several proof of concept exploits available online. There are Nuclei templates that people have been using for scanning their own environments to see where they're impacted. So it looks like that's one thing to note, that that this is starting to get exploited in the wild. Secondly, all three hyperscale cloud providers have already released advisories that you should check out if you're using them, Amazon, Azure, and GCP, specific to how this vulnerability impacts their managed Kubernetes solutions. And I think that's like the main thing. Like, a lot of people have been writing about this. A lot of people have been looking into it and writing follow-up blog posts. I'm sure this isn't the last time we'll talk about this, because there's probably going to be follow-ups, just because, like we spoke about with Near, Kubernetes is a very interesting attack surface that's largely unexplored, and there are probably other vulnerabilities like this lurking around.
And on top of that, this one requires manual patching, so it'll probably
Yeah.
have a bit of a tail.
Exactly.
Okay, next. The Next.js vulnerability.
What are we talking about next?
Uh,
This is like a who's on first situation.
Really. Okay. So a serious security flaw was discovered at Next.js, which is a popular web framework. Specifically, it's a middleware for React. And the way this vulnerability works is that it lets attackers completely bypass logins and security checks. Um, do you want to explain in a little bit more detail how it works, Amitai?
Sure. So I'm no front-end expert, but as far as I can understand, this was a vulnerability affecting React middleware called Next.js, as you mentioned. And the idea is that by manipulating headers on servers that are running the affected version, you can basically bypass authentication and authorization checks. Now, it's a bit difficult to know exactly if you are affected by this or not because it depends on how you're using Next.js since it's a component. But there have already been a few Nuclei templates being released by a few different companies that have been effective to some degree at filtering out false positives and false negatives. Um, and you should definitely use those in correlation with servers that you know to be vulnerable based on the version of Next.js that they're using. That's the strategy that we've chosen at Wiz.
Yeah. Also, this affects like millions of websites because Next.js is the most widely used framework for building.
If this was something relatively rare or something that organizations had only had a few instances of, then you wouldn't really be in a dilemma because you could just patch everything and you wouldn't really care. But the fact that you have so many instances across your environment means you need to triage this, and you're not necessarily going to be able to patch everything. So being able to do an unauthenticated scan from the outside and say like, oh, this is where Next.js is actually being used. This is where the header that I can manipulate is, it's actually listening to that header, then that lets you triage a bit better.
Now, also, if you can't update it right away, we have an interim solution suggested, which is to block any requests that contain the x dash middleware dash sub request header at your website's edge. And that's it. That's what we have to say about Next.js. People were really talking about it, and then and then other crazier things came up, but it is important to address, so don't forget about it. Don't sleep on it.
Yeah, this vulnerability could also have like a long tail depending on how fast people are patching this.
Depending on you. For our next story, we have the alleged Oracle breach. Depends who you're asking. Here's what happened. In late March, a threat actor called Rose87168, and they claimed to have stolen over 6 million records from Oracle Cloud's SSO and LDAP systems. Allegedly stolen data happens to include sensitive authentication materials like JKS files, encrypted passwords, key files, a lot of fun stuff. If it's true, again, alleged, then it could affect very many Oracle Cloud tenants. They're saying upwards of 140,000. The if here is key. I'm going to let Abitai give the juice about the he said, she said.
I'm preparing the juice in the juicer.
Mixing.
So people make claims on the dark web and on websites like breach forums all the time. Sometimes they're telling the truth, sometimes they're lying, sometimes they're telling half truths. In this case, the threat actor has made very bombastic claims, which Oracle has denied. Oracle has said there has been no breach of Oracle Cloud. There is no war in Ba Sing Se, if that tells you anything. And the problem here is that they've also provided proof which looks pretty convincing. Like they basically said, we gained access to this system, and then they shared a link to a URL hosted on an Oracle server where their username shows up, which kind of shows that they had some level of access there. That doesn't mean that they had the type of access that they're claiming that they had. That doesn't prove that, but it does prove that they had some sort of access. They were able to run code or able to write files to that system. So to say that there has been no breach at all doesn't seem like it's 100% true. In the meantime, Oracle is also dealing with another breach of another service called Oracle Health. And I think they have given that one a bit more credence. But the Oracle Cloud stuff is still sort of very much in the air. I think this was published, I think, like 2 weeks ago, and it's still very unclear what actually happened. And like we're getting a lot of questions from customers about like what's going on here. Do I need to be concerned about this? And I think at this point, the best thing you can do is just assume that there has been some sort of breach. I will say that there have been theories that perhaps the threat actor didn't gain access to Oracle Cloud's managed service. Perhaps what they did here was they found a vulnerability or used an older vulnerability affecting Oracle's self-hosted servers.
Yeah, wait. So let's assume the worst. What should I do, self-hosted or hosted, if I think I may possibly be affected?
So if we assume the worst, if we assume that there has been a breach of like everything to some degree, then I think the safest route here would be to rotate credentials associated with Oracle's SSO and LDAP and the OAM systems. Um, and the other thing would be to check audit logs going back, like, I don't know, a few weeks, a few months, depending how cautious you want to be, to see if there have been any strange usage of those credentials. But I think rotating is probably the safest bet right now. And this next thing you should do is you should make sure that you're patching against older vulnerabilities affecting SSO systems, which is always a good idea. But in this case, it seems like a better idea than usual. I am very curious to know what'll happen here. Like if Oracle will say, like I think they need to shed some light here. Like they need to either say, there hasn't been a breach, but this did happen, like something did happen, and sort of say this is the limit of what happened. I think they do need to explain what happened that allowed this threat actor to gain right access to the server that they showed proof of, at least.
Yeah, also, what's the T we're looking for this podcast's next news episode? So if they could give us a little bit more to work with.
And by
Alright,
the way, some people that have supposedly been impacted by this are saying that yeah, like the passwords that they released are real, like those are our passwords. But again, those could have been taken from somewhere else. So it's still a big mystery.
for our last story of the Apache Camel overhyped 0-day. There was a CVE 2025 27636. It was privately disclosed to Apache, but then the details leaked early. And then like technical exploit details started circulating before patches were available. They think AT&T was the one who leaked it, but AT&T was definitely the one who discovered it. And then panic ensued. Security teams took this premature disclosure and really, they got hyped up. But then reality kicked in and it was not as big and bad and scary, nearly as big and bad and scary as people thought it was going to be. What was the reality of this vulnerability, Amitai?
So when the rumors started circulating, it sounded like this was going to be like the next Log4Shell, like it's an Apache vulnerability affecting something that's relatively prevalent. Um, and I think it was described as like a 0-day, maybe even it was described as an RCE. And then, once the details were out, it turned out that Apache themselves had considered this to only be like medium, moderate severity. Um, Secondly, there were very specific conditions for this to be exploited. Like it isn't exploitable by default, and it only allows you to do very specific things. So the impact is very dependent on what application you're exploiting. So nothing like Log4Shell. Um, the TLDR of the technical details is that like you can only call methods in the same bean, which is a Java concept that have been declared in the bean URI, And the methods that you have access to, even if you have access to them, they might not be useful to an attacker in the first place. So it only lets you have access to the specific methods, and those methods might not even be useful for exploitation. And far from every application is vulnerable to this. I don't think we have exact stats, but we estimate it to be very low.
Can you explain technically how this can be leveraged, Amitai?
So Apache Camel has a filter that by default was meant to prevent an external attacker from being able to send certain headers that are considered sensitive. And the way this vulnerability worked was that the filter turned out to be case sensitive, meaning that if you tried to send a certain request that was dangerous, and you used incorrect casing, then you passed. It's sort of like a web application firewall vulnerability, because just like this filtering system turned out to be very brittle. So like instead of writing like a header that had, let's say, camel, uh, you know, uh, small letter and then everything else big, or big letter and then everything else small, you could sort of mix it up, and then that would bypass the filter.
So TLDR, check if your caps lock is on or not. Just kidding. The actual way to handle this is to patch it, but don't be stressed because it's pretty low in priorities.
Yeah, like there are other vulnerabilities out there that you should be more concerned about. You should definitely patch this because it is exploitable. Um, but I don't think you need to be overly stressed about this. It just needs to, be on your to-do list.
Yeah, and I think the real takeaway is that we should let vendors fix vulnerabilities before details become public.
Mhm.
So we keep people's expectations and reactions level.
Yeah, and rumors are dangerous. Like this wasted.
I love rumors, but they're dangerous.
I just think about like how much time this wasted for defenders. Like it came out, I think it came out like over the weekend or something, and people were really stressing out about this and trying to like asking each other like, do you know what's going on, do you have details about this, like what is this, is are we going to spend like the next few weeks patching this, like is it going to be like log4shell? And um if this had just come out, nobody would have paid it any attention. Like if there hadn't been the preamble of like, this is going to be horrible, there's a
They wouldn't
rumor.
get to be on our podcast if they had.
True, exactly. Like we're still wasting time. In fact, like you and I are wasting our time by talking about this. We're wasting our listeners' time by talking about this. They should shut off the podcast now.
You don't have to shut it off because we have finished this episode. So, on that note,
If you've come this far, you might as well stick with us till the end.
what are the takeaways for this episode?
So for the GitHub quadruple supply chain attack, I'd say first of all, read our blog to learn more details and know A, if how to check if you were affected by this, and B, what you should be doing in your own code and in your own GitHub actions to prevent this kind of thing from happening in the future. For IngressNightmare, pretty much same deal. Read our blog posts, figure out how to protect yourself. For Next.js, as I mentioned, I think the best strategy here is to figure out where you are using this library in a vulnerable version, and then use unauthenticated scanning to check where it can be exploited. For the Oracle breach, rotate your creds just in case. I hope more information comes to light, but it may remain a mystery. And with Apache Camel, add the patch to your to-do list, but don't stress out. And watch the CISO musical.
And if you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe and share a link to the podcast, but not your cloud keys. And as always, if your cloud security strategy is making you cry, don't worry. Just cry out cloud.